An important lesson from the video is about the transformation from good people to monsters, and the psychological factors that drive this process. It starts with someone who is virtuous, kind, and always fighting for justice. But over time, they can gradually become cruel, deceitful, and even destructive. The primary driver in this transformation is the gradual erosion of moral boundaries. Small, justifiable compromises, like lying to protect someone or minor wrongdoing excused as necessary, are the first steps toward irreversible change. These seemingly harmless actions slowly dull the conscience, making actions that were once unthinkable seem more reasonable. This phenomenon is known as the slippery slope effect, where an individual begins to engage in behaviors they would never have considered before. Therefore, the shift from good to monster is not an unexpected event but the result of a series of decisions and actions that go unrecognized. An important psychological factor in transforming good people into monsters is the powerful influence of authority and obedience. Through Stanley Milgram's famous experiment, we see that many people will commit cruel acts when directed by someone in a position of authority, even when they know they are causing harm to others. Specifically, obedience to authority can cause people to silence their moral thoughts and justify their wrongful actions by saying, "I was just following orders." This shows that, in certain situations, a person may do evil not out of malice, but simply because they feel pressured or fear the consequences of not obeying. This process is one of the dangerous mechanisms that can turn a good person into a harmful one without them even realizing it. This respect for authority blinds them to self-awareness and reduces their capacity to critically challenge their actions, making wrongful behavior seem justified in their eyes. One of the key factors in the transformation of good people into monsters is the development of an us versus them mentality. Something that Schopenhauer and many other thinkers have pointed out. When individuals become deeply attached to a group, be it political, religious, social, or ideological, they begin to view those outside of their group as enemies or less valuable. This is when dehumanization occurs, a powerful tool in the process of turning good people into monsters. Dehumanization makes it easier to justify cruelty, violence, or oppression toward others because they are no longer seen as deserving of empathy or compassion. History has shown that many horrific crimes were not committed by inherently evil people, but by those who considered themselves good, simply because they were convinced that their enemies were evil. The hostility between groups often begins with small differences and is magnified over time, turning individuals into instruments of cruelty without them even realizing it. A critical element in the transformation of good people into monsters is the justification of their wrongful actions. People often don't realize that they are changing because they create narratives and reasons to defend their actions and themselves. This self-justification allows them to maintain the belief that they are still good people, still on the side of justice, even though their actions are going against the very principles they once upheld. This leads to a phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance, where a person's actions no longer align with their values. Instead of changing their actions, they change their beliefs to justify those actions. They convince themselves that doing wrong is reasonable or necessary. For example, saying, "I did this to protect a greater cause," or "they deserved this." This not only blinds them but also makes it easier to continue down a path of destruction without feeling guilt or remorse. Another key factor contributing to the transformation of good people into monsters is the power of authority and obedience. According to Stanley Milgram's research, one of the most famous psychological experiments on obedience to authority, people can commit harmful acts simply because someone in power tells them to. In the experiment, participants carried out actions they believed to be wrong, even causing harm to others, just because they were following orders from someone in authority. This shows that even good people can be drawn into harmful behavior when placed in a situation where they feel obligated to obey commands, even though they know those actions are wrong. This obedience reduces an individual's ability to judge and makes it harder for them to see their actions clearly. Obedience to authority is an incredibly important factor in the transformation of a person's character because it can lead them to go against their original values and ethics, simply because they feel there is no other choice but to follow orders. Another key factor in the transformation of good people into monsters is the shift in perspective between us and them, in group versus out-group. When people become deeply attached to a group, whether it's political, religious, or social, they begin to see those outside of the group as enemies. This psychological shift can lead to the formation of an enemy of my enemy is my friend mentality, where people within the group are seen as righteous, while outsiders are viewed as objects to be discarded, even subject to brutality and oppression. History has shown time and time again that horrific acts have been committed by people who once saw themselves as good and moral, only to be drawn into wrongful actions because they viewed those outside their group as undeserving of empathy or respect. This has occurred in many wars, political conflicts, and social upheavals, where battles were no longer about defending an ideal but about destroying those perceived as enemies, who were no longer seen as human. As a result, the erosion of compassion, the dehumanization of others, and the lack of empathy pushed people toward actions they would never have committed if they recognized those individuals as beings with feelings like their own. One of the critical factors that turn good people into monsters is self-justification. People often don't realize they're going astray until it's too late because they've created a narrative that allows them to justify their wrongdoings. These justifications make them feel like they're still good, even when their actions contradict their original moral values. This ability to self-justify is not a new concept. Psychologists refer to it as cognitive dissonance, where an individual's actions conflict with their personal beliefs. Rather than change their actions, people alter their beliefs to reduce the psychological tension, which prevents them from realizing they are becoming someone they never thought they would be. For instance, someone who always sees themselves as kind and ethical might find themselves in a situation where they have to do something bad. They may justify their actions by telling themselves that it was necessary or that the victim deserved it. This self-justification is what pushes them down a path of immoral actions they would never have taken before. It's a powerful defense mechanism of the mind, but without recognizing and confronting it, one can easily become part of the machinery of cruelty they once opposed. Understanding that we, too, are capable of self-justification is crucial because only by acknowledging this can we fight against this moral degradation and maintain our ethical values. Another key factor that leads to the transformation from good people to monsters is dehumanization. When people begin to see others no longer as individuals worthy of respect, but as enemies, threats, or inferior beings, they no longer feel guilty about causing harm to them. This process diminishes empathy, making violent actions seem justifiable and acceptable. Dehumanization often happens within group contexts, particularly in war or conflict situations, where members of the opposing group are viewed as less than human and not deserving of fair treatment. This process does not only occur on a large scale during wars but also happens in everyday life, such as in workplaces, schools, or personal relationships. When someone starts viewing another person as an enemy or untrustworthy, their empathy for them begins to fade. These individuals may justify their actions by labeling the other person as evil, which allows them to do things they once thought unimaginable. These actions can range from social exclusion, gossip, or even violence toward those they have dehumanized. The critical point here is recognizing that we, too, can fall into this mindset. The pressures of society, the environment, and the groups we belong to can influence us, pushing us to view others as enemies, undeserving of respect. To avoid being swept up in the cycle of dehumanization, we need to cultivate empathy and the ability to see the value in every person, regardless of their group affiliation or differing opinions. One of the key factors in the transformation from good people to monsters is the self-justification of wrongful actions. People rarely see themselves as villains, even when they are committing heinous acts. Instead, they create narratives that allow them to believe they are still good, still on the side of righteousness. This process is a powerful psychological mechanism known as cognitive dissonance, where individuals do not change their actions but change their beliefs to rationalize their behavior. For example, when someone finds themselves doing something wrong, rather than admitting their wrongdoing, they justify that they had no other choice, or the person they harmed deserved it, or their actions were for a greater good. This justification allows them to continue seeing themselves as good while doing things they once thought unimaginable. However, this not only allows them to continue their harmful actions but also erodes their ability to recognize their own mistakes. This is one of the most dangerous mechanisms in the process of transforming good people into monsters. It allows people to continue acting with cruelty without their conscience being an obstacle. Many historical examples show that horrific atrocities, wars, and violent acts were not committed by people who saw themselves as evil, but by those who believed they were on the right side of history and justified their actions with righteous reasons or defending peace. The critical point here is recognizing that we, too, are capable of self-justifying our wrongdoings if we are not mindful of this process. To prevent this, we need to constantly examine our actions and motives, ask ourselves why we behave in certain ways, and whether we are covering up wrongful actions under the guise of righteousness. Another critical factor in the transformation from good people to monsters is the loss of empathy for others, a process known as dehumanization. When a person begins to see others as enemies, threats, or individuals deserving harm, they lose the ability to feel the suffering of others, and this creates a void that enables cruel actions to take place. This dehumanization allows individuals to carry out harmful acts without feeling guilty. For example, in war, soldiers are often trained not to view the enemy as human beings. They are taught to see the enemy as a threat that needs to be eradicated, rather than as individuals with families, lives, and emotions similar to their own. When a person no longer sees the other side as human, they are free from the guilt of their actions, making it easier to carry out atrocities without hesitation. This phenomenon does not only occur in wars or large political conflicts but also in daily life. When we start to see others as the enemy or the outsider rather than fellow human beings, we are more likely to justify harming them, whether in the workplace, in personal relationships, or even on social media platforms. One way to stop this process and avoid becoming a monster is to strengthen our ability to empathize. When we make an effort to understand and share the feelings of others, we are less likely to commit cruel actions and, instead, become more compassionate. Empathy helps us maintain our connection to those around us and reminds us that everyone has their own story and emotions. This doesn't mean we should overlook the mistakes of others or excuse bad behavior, but rather that we should see them as real human beings and try to understand their motives and circumstances before passing judgment. Doing so not only helps us maintain our humanity but also protects us from engaging in the cruel acts we never imagined we could commit. The important message we can draw from the transformation of good people into monsters is the necessity of maintaining empathy and self-awareness in every circumstance. People don't always realize when they are changing and gradually losing their humanity. Small actions like justifying wrongdoings, following authority blindly, or creating distinctions between us and them are factors that can lead to moral decay. Therefore, the crucial lesson is to consistently maintain self-awareness, reflect on our actions, and evaluate them objectively, instead of letting self-justification or external influences push us down the wrong path. Empathy is a vital tool in preserving our connection to humanity. When we see others not as enemies, not distinguishing them based on any characteristics but instead recognizing them as human beings just like ourselves, we maintain compassion in society. We must understand that every action we take can impact others, and protecting the humanity in our lives is not only an individual responsibility but also a communal one. This lesson helps us not only stop harming ourselves but also prevent us from harming others, fostering a healthier, kinder, and fairer environment.